This is a brief review for exam 2. I will go through high-yield concepts and high-yield slides that will help students in exam 2. However, this does not cover all the concepts or all the questions that you will see on the exam. Instead, I have uploaded an exam 2 study guide, which is very comprehensive. If you are able to know each of the concepts that are listed on that sheet, then you will be good to go for this exam. The study guide is organized and broken down into each of these lectures where there are certain concepts I want for students to be familiar with before the exam. If you want to use this and modify and take some notes down, that will be helpful in making sure that you know these items. If you go all the way below, you will also recognize that there are going to be some questions from muscle and action. For this exam, attachment, action, which is insertion, origin, and action, will be questioned. Innovation will not be questioned. This will cover muscles 31 through 70 in these subsections. And for this exam, to make it even easier, I will only question on 20 select muscles, which are also given to students as part of this modules review section. So if you know these 20 muscles, their insertions, origins, and actions, you will see 5 of these on the exam, and you should be able to do well. Now let's go back to reviewing some of these high-yield slides. Know the different connective tissue covering that surrounds the different muscle fibers. You have the epimysium, perimysium, and the endomysium. Epi on the outside, peri, middle, endo, the innermost layers. And know this particular structure when it comes to connective tissue that surrounds muscles. And also know about the sarcomere. That is the functional unit of the muscle. This is the unit that helps with contractions. Know these different zones, the A band, the I band, what it encompasses, the actin, the myosin, and also know about the Z line. In between two Z lines, you get the sarcomere. This is shown here as well. Uh, you have these dark fibers, these light fibers. The region which have these dark fibers are the myosin fibers, they don't move. And you have the actin thin fibers. When this muscle unit contracts, the actin moves over the myosin to help contract the muscles. Know the neuromuscular junction. You have this synapse where a nerve comes and brings messages to muscles to perform actions. And the neurotransmitter used in this case is acetylcholine. And know how muscles contract. I mentioned we have the myosin, the thick fibers, the thin fibers, which are the actin. They have these heads on these myosin fibers, which pull on the actin closer together, causing contraction. And this is shown in this particular slide. Know how muscles and bones work together to form levers and help with movement. We talked about 3 different types of levers in our class, where depending upon where the muscle is attached, how it is pulled, and where the force comes from, that will help with movements. So bones and muscles work together as levers to create or to help with movement. Know the different muscles in the face, muscles of mastication. Know the rotator cuff muscle groups. We mentioned some of these even as we discussed these muscle groups. We have the supraspinatus muscle, the infraspinatus muscle, teres minor, and subscapularis. So these 4 muscles create the rotator cuff muscle group. The central nervous system has 2 major divisions. The nervous system has 2 major divisions, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. CNS includes the brain and the spinal cord. PNS, the peripheral nervous system, includes the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. The nervous system also could be divided into a sensory division, which brings messages to the brain, and a motor division, which carries out function. The motor division is subdivided again to somatic, which is voluntary movement, and autonomic, which is involuntary movement. I know the structure of a neuron. It follows the same structure of all cells, but it's slightly specialized where it has the cell body. And we have this long structure called the axon and the short hands called the dendrites. And we have Schwann cells that surrounds the axons, creating a myelin sheath. And recognize there are different types of neurons. Sensory neurons brings messages towards the CNS. You have interneurons that will communicate between the sensory and the motor, and motor neurons take the messages back to uh, the gland or the muscle that will carry out the function. Know the supportive cells in the peripheral nervous system. We have the Schwann cells, the satellite cells. Schwann cells produce myelin sheaths that surrounds the axon, and this helps speeds up the nerve impulses. Know what the synapse is. It's the communication between two nerves or the communication between a nerve and a muscle. The presynaptic neuron is before the synapse, postsynaptic neuron is after the synapse. And how do they communicate? Via neurotransmitters. Know the difference and the concepts of convergence and divergence. Convergence, many neurons coming and bringing the signal to one neuron. Divergence, one signal is divided into many neurons. This is important in making certain signals more sensitive, to amplify certain signals, and also to be able to get signals from a larger region and recognize it as one. Make sure to know the resting potential. It is at a minus 70 millivolts. How we have more sodium on the outside, extracellular fluid, and more potassium on within the cells intracellularly. And this resting potential is disturbed when nerve impulses travel, known as action potential. The resting potential is helped maintained by the sodium potassium pump, where you have this pump that will use ATP. So when it uses ATP, this is an active transport. It sends three sodiums out, it takes three sodiums out, and it brings two potassiums in. So that's why you get more sodium extracellularly, more potassium intracellularly. But since the exchange is three outside, two inside, we get that outside is more positive, inside is more negative. And that's how you get the minus 70 resting potential. And realize how these action potentials travel. And with these myelinated cells, action potentials jumps from node to node. These nodes are called nodes of Ranvier. These myelin sheets are formed by Schwann cells. There is this event of a depolarization. So you have the resting potential at minus 70 millivolts. When you get a signal, you have this depolarization event, and then these sodium potassium pumps will come into play and bring it back to the uh, resting potential state. You don't need to know about the hyperpolarization. And then how do nerve impulse travel along an axon? You have these local depolarization events that happen. So it happens in one location, and that is transmitted to the next, and it's transmitted to the next. By this time, you have the repolarization events happening, just as seen here by the sodium potassium pumps, and then comes back to the resting potential. This way, this impulse is able to travel across the axon. And this shows how myelination is happened. It's wrapping around the axon, and this is important to speed up messages. Know the different components of the brain. We discussed the cerebrum, the diencephalon, cerebellum, and the brainstem. Know the different parts of the brainstem, the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Know the concept of a reflux arc. You have these sensory receptors that will respond to a harsh stimuli. That message is brought to the spinal cord. Since a quick response is needed, rather than sending this message to the brain, it will respond quickly and activate the action of a muscle. So it goes from a sensory receptor to the sensory neuron to the interneuron to a motor neuron and to the effector muscle. And know the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, the involuntary nervous system. We talked about sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic helps with the fight and flight response, um, getting the body prepared for action. Parasympathetic is the point where you can rest, you can digest, more of a relaxed state in the body. And all sensors fall into two broader categories. You have somatic sensors, it's widely distributed. Four different somatic sensors are touch, pressure, temperature, and pain. Then we have specialized sensors, which we discussed in detail, and these are mostly concentrated in the head region, and this helps with visual, hearing, smell, taste, and balance. We talked about different types of sensors that will act as receptors, bringing different sensations. They are listed right here. We discussed the difference between sensation, perception, and projection. Sensation is the awareness that a stimulus happens. Perception is how the brain interprets the message. Projection is the brain sending back the signal to the point of origin so that we will be able to pinpoint where the stimulus came from or where the sensation came from. However, because of this projection, we also discuss a concept called referred pain, where we will have certain pain referred to a certain different area in the body. We'll discuss that shortly also. Sensory adaptation is when you have a loud stimulus over and over again, we become less responsive to that stimulus. We discussed the different touch and pressure receptors. So the more generalized sensors that we have know that free nerve endings are more superficial, touch receptors are superficial, the pressure receptors are more deep. So you have to have more pressure before they are activated. We discussed just briefly referred pain when the brain projects where the message came from. Since there are sharing of neurons, there might be some referred pain. Heart can be referred to certain regions of the skin, so can some other internal organs. You are not required to know the specific organs and where it's referred to, but know what referred pain is. And this is what we talked about, how there are neurons that come and they converge into one neuron, and therefore when the projection happens, that will go to the skin and not to where the original pain occurred from. And know what visceral pain is and in relation to referred pain. Visceral pain feels as it comes from referred pain feels as if visceral pain, pain from visceral organs, happen from another area of the body. Know the different parts of the ear. We have the auricle, the external ear, the external acoustic meatus, the eardrum, start in the inner ear, know the three bones that transmit sound, and then know the components of the inner ear. The three auditory ossicles in the inner ear, incus, malleus, and stapes. Know these three smallest bones in the body. And the functions of the auditory tube and how it helps maintain equal air pressure on both sides of the eardrum. And we also talked about sensory equilibrium, static equilibrium, dynamic equilibrium, how the inner ear has this function of helping us balance when we are standing still or even when we are moving. Know the intrinsic muscles of the eye. We discuss 6 different muscles: the superior rectus, lateral rectus, inferior rectus, medial rectus, superior oblique, and inferior oblique. Know what happens when these muscles contract. So here is also an example showing the different movements. Even the superior rectus contracts, the eye has an upward gaze, looks up. Inferior rectus looks down. Medial rectus looks towards the medial, to the center. Lateral rectus, we look outside. When the superior oblique is contracted, we have this lateral rotation and also upward gaze. Actually, lateral rotation and upward gaze, that is correct. When it's the inferior oblique, we have this medial rotation and a downward gaze. Know the 2 different types of photoreceptors, the rods and the cones. Rods are very much more abundant and helps provide black and white vision, whereas cones provide sharp images, colored visions, and they are densely packed at the fovea centralis. It is shown right here. And we'll lastly discuss a little bit about the endocrine system. There's a lot of information here, but please focus on what we talked about in the lecture. Look at the different negative feedback mechanisms that are involved. Know what particular organ produce what hormones, and what are their associated function. So the main idea is to maintain homeostasis in the body. Endocrine glands secrete hormones to the blood or body fluid and has an action somewhere else in the body. This is different from exocrine glands. So exocrine glands put out their secretions locally in that region, endocrine glands into the blood vessels and take it somewhere else. And then here's a comparison between how neurons transmit their messages and how endocrine organs transmit their messages through the bloodstream to reach the target cells. There were 2 different types of hormones, steroids and non-steroids. We discuss how steroids function. They can travel through the cell membrane. Non-steroids cannot travel through the cell membrane. Therefore, they will activate receptors that will then carry out the function within the cells. Here, the main idea is to know that hormonal secretions are controlled by negative feedback mechanisms. Know certain thyroid diseases, hypothyroid, less thyroid, hyperthyroid, more thyroid, why it happens, and what are some of the outcomes. And also know the properties or effects of the parathyroid hormone. Regulates calcium and regulates vitamin D. So when parathyroid hormone is released, it's going to help release calcium into the bloodstream. And we also talked about calcitonin is another enzyme that inhibits or acts opposite to this process. We discussed pancreas as having both exocrine and endocrine function. And for this lecture, we focus more on the endocrine function of the pancreas, beta cells producing insulin and glucagon. So insulin and glucagon and their function. Insulin helps store sugars in fat cells, and whereas glucagon produced by the alpha cells will break down glycogen into glucose and release sugar into the blood. So that is the cycle. Diabetes mellitus, lack of insulin, or the inability to recognize insulin. Type 1 diabetes is where there is an autoimmune disease and you don't produce insulin anymore. Type 2 diabetes, you produce insulin, but the cells are not as sensitive to the insulin. And finally, know what the pineal gland is, where it's located, and that it secretes melatonin, which helps regulate the circadian rhythm, sleep cycles.